Mindfulness of Breathing Sutta, Discourse on Mindfulness of Breathing, or the Anapanasati Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya 118. And this is the fourth talk, and I think the final one in this series. The Buddha specified and singled out this technique, this approach to meditation, as especially powerful, and called it the abode of the Tathagata, which is his epithet for himself. And it was the technique that he said he dwelt in, or the meditative path that he used. And in the West, it was initially taught in a very simplistic way, and I think this is one of the culprits for why samadhi practice, the practice of bringing the mind to unification, has been so difficult to teach effectively in the West, is because it has been taught in a very simplistic way, where a practitioner is told to bring their attention to one point and keep it there and try not to control the breath. Usually one is told to bring the mind or awareness to the tip of the nose. And there's a sutta I've referenced called the Aritta Sutta, where the Buddha asks the monks how they practice mindfulness of breathing. And one, Venerable Aritta, responds that he puts aside thoughts of the past, thoughts of the future, and knows his inhalations and exhalations in the moment. And the Buddha kind of nods to him and says, yes, that is mindfulness of breathing, I don't deny it, but as to how mindfulness of breathing is developed in full, listen and I will speak. And then he teaches this sutta, or an equivalent of it, which is an extremely robust and practical approach and a much wider scope applied to how one works with the breath. The Anapanasati Sutta, this mindfulness of breathing discourse, is composed of 16 steps, and the 16 steps are divided into 4 groups, or tetrads. Each group is correlated to one of the 4 foundations of mindfulness, which are the bases, or the frameworks that the Buddha gives for looking into one's experience. And those are mindfulness of the body, mindfulness of feelings, mindfulness of the mind or heart, and then mindfulness of Dhammas, which can roughly be translated as Dhamma categories, basically the framework of the teachings applied to one's experience. So usually those are described in detail as positive qualities of the mind, the enlightenment factors, and negative qualities, the hindrances, and parsing out one's experience into one or the other. So each of the 4 tetrads corresponds to one of those, and in ascending order as well. So to begin, one sits with the body erect, and it can be helpful to bring one's awareness to each vertebrae, starting at the lumbar and drawing it in, and then moving up vertebrae by vertebrae to the point where one gets to the crown of the head and can imagine that a string is suspending one's spine from above, so that one sits with the body invigorated by the erect posture, but not tight, in a relaxed way. One broadens the chest, softens the neck, lowers the chin. And intuitively, one can say that one tries to sit with dignity. And from here, the first tetrad begins with breathing in long, one knows, I breathe in long. Breathing out long, one knows, I breathe out long. Breathing in short, one knows, I breathe in short. Breathing out short, one knows, I breathe out short. And this is where we can bring our attention to the fore and really analyze the length of the breath, as this allows us to anchor attention very clearly. When one has to know how long the breath is, then it's very easy to see when the mind is wandering. But this step also allows one to work with the length and comfort of the breath very explicitly. One of the difficulties with how mindfulness of breathing is frequently taught is one is told to not control the breath at all. But we are controlling creatures by nature, especially the modern educated mind, and to just try to not control anything means that our residual momentum from the day simply goes under the surface and operates at a subterranean level. And this is when the breath gets hot, tight, and forced. So it's better to work at first explicitly with that tendency to control, very consciously. And if one wants to work to see what way of breathing feels most comfortable, then that can be quite helpful. So initially taking long, deep breaths for a few, 3 or 4, drawing the breath deep into the lungs, waiting and then releasing it slowly. 3 long breaths like that can really calm the mind. And then finding a rhythm of breath that feels comfortable. And in fact, one can think of this breathing in long and short more as breathing in perhaps light and heavy and comfortable, uncomfortable. You can apply these terms, but you're analyzing the breath. And this is, the Buddha at the beginning of the sutta says that fulfilling the 16 steps of breath meditation fulfills the 7 factors of enlightenment. The second of which is an analysis of Dhammas. The first is mindfulness, and we've already brought that to the fore just by sitting down and bringing our attention. But this analyzing the length of the breath, the comfort of the breath, that's the second enlightenment factor, analysis of qualities. The third step is to breathe in, training thus. Breathing in, one trains thus. I will breathe in sensitive to the whole body. Breathing out, I will be sensitive to the whole body. And whereas this has been interpreted in later texts as placing one's awareness squarely on the nose and paying attention to the whole body of the breath at the nose. Increasingly, modern scholarship, and certainly the experience of most practitioners I know, including great teachers such as Ajahn Sucitto, Ajahn Jayasaro, Ajahn Jeff, Ajahn Lee, and recent scholarship by Bhante Analio and others, point to the fact that the Buddha's conception of the whole body was just what it says, that this is supposed to be an expansion of awareness to encompass the whole body. And this is a much more robust and accessible way of approaching the breath for the modern mind. Because instead of forcing one's attention to one point when the mind may yet have a great deal of energy from the day, one expands its scope to encompass the whole body. And it's as if instead of yelling at a classroom of second graders to be quiet and write out a worksheet of math problems, you allow them in their initial energetic phase to run outside for a bit and go do some wholesome activity like a team builder or maybe gather samples from a pond. You're giving the mind in its active mode coming from the day a very wide playground, which is the entire body. And in this context, the breath, or pana, as it's known in Pali, or prana in Sanskrit, chi in Taoist thought, is not just the explicit sensation of wind at the nostrils, but rather the vital energy that runs through the body as a whole. And this energy can take a time to get accustomed to, but its general movement can be thought of along two central meridians, down the front of the body and up the spine. Or some people may find it easier to conceptualize as down the spine and up the body, or up the front of the body. Different systems have different ways of visualizing. But in order to cultivate this awareness of the whole body, as modern meditators, we tend to be stuck in our heads and think of the neck as, or the body as something to keep our necks from dragging on the ground, as Ajahn Amaro says. And to instead begin with, first I find an expedient means before meditation is very helpful, because as modern people, we really are trapped in our heads and alienated from our bodies in the somatic sense. So exercising a bit, doing qigong, taking a cold shower, some way of dropping the awareness down into the diaphragm. And then when one meditates on this third step of cultivating awareness of the whole body, I find the easiest visualization for me personally, not so much even a visualization, but one divides the body into three chambers. And initially, one can place the awareness in, say, a bubble just around the head in this top chamber and breathe there for a time. And then after a while, one will feel the awareness drop to the chest and torso around the heart area. And one can rest there, the awareness there for a time as one breathes. And then down to the dantian near the belly button. And then after one has breathed there for a time, expanding awareness to encompass the whole body and breathing there, and repeating these steps. Other useful means can be visualizing light coursing down through the crown of the head, down to the feet, breathing in white light mist through the kidneys, through the shoulder blades. The Buddha's analogy here is of a bathman kneading water into a ball of bath powder, which at the time of the Buddha was what they used to bathe, like soap. But just as one would knead water into flour to make dough, so one needs this refreshment, this awareness into the body. And that's what these visualizations, these applied perceptions are doing, is circulating this awareness through our body. And the fourth step of the Anapanasati Sutta is to calm those bodily energies and fabrications. So as one needs in this breath energy to the body, this subtle energy, then one encounters certain knots in the subtle body, say at the throat or the belly, and relaxes and softens them, or one begins to realize that one is squeezing the lungs open and closed very coarsely and to force the breath in and out, but that actually one doesn't have to do this, and that the breath can become much more subtle if one sort of consciously relaxes and calms that bodily, what's called a bodily fabrication, that sensation of squeezing the coarse bellows of the lungs. And this is the, this is the fourth step. So as one becomes sensitive to this, we enter into the next tetrad, which is mindfulness of feelings in the body, or corresponds to it. So one becomes sensitive to rapture. What in Pali is, the word is piti, P-I-T-I, but it's better perhaps translated as refreshment. And the Buddha uses images of water frequently for this sensation. As one has cultivated this full body awareness, one does become sensitive to this subtle energy running up the spine, down the front of the body, or in some other direction in the meridians. And it provides a huge, deep sense of nourishment. We don't realize how starved parts of our bodies have been for this sense, but it begins to course, and there's a sense of soaking it up like a sponge. And the Buddha compares this moment, this is an analogy he gives for the second jhana, but I think it roughly corresponds here, of a cool lake with a cool spring of water welling up from below, and occasional showers from above. And I think those are interesting images because one does become sensitive to different flavors of this rapture. From below, it tends to be a bit more robust, and from above, it tends to be a bit more refined and bright. And I think maybe the suttas are pointing at that, although the Burmese edition doesn't include the bit about showers from above. But one does get a sense that one is being fed this energy from the earth below and from the crown of the head. This corresponds to the third enlightenment factor of the third enlightenment factor in all of this is energy. And this is important because in those earlier steps with bringing awareness to the whole body, one should still maintain awareness of the breath in the background. And that refrain of the breath is one's anchor throughout, breathing in, breathing out. Through every step, that should be in the background, in the peripheral awareness. And one has to put forth a constant effort to keep that, and not get lost in, say, the sensation of refreshment. Because that breath is the cause for all that. So to keep that there, that's one's effort. And then this rapture arising, this is the fourth enlightenment factor, the refreshment. The next step is becoming sensitive to pleasure. And after the refreshment, the subtle energy has begun to course up the spine, down the front, or in some other direction. A static or still field begins to form in the body. It's almost like the emergent still magnetic field that forms from a circulating electric current. And it's also a sense of fullness. One has soaked in this pleasure and this refreshment. And at this point, the body's energy becomes much more quiet, and frequently a nimitta, a sign, as we know it in Pali, begins to manifest. So an awareness of light in the visual field is very common. or awareness of the sound of silence, which is a subtle hissing in the ears, which one can cultivate as a meditation object. And one rests in this more still sense of sukha, or pleasure. And I think this can roughly correspond to the Buddha's analogy that he gives to the third jhana of a lotus. And these tetrads do not correspond perfectly to the jhanas, but the imagery is quite apt, I find, of a lotus growing in a pool of cool water, completely submerged, so that no part of it's unpervaded by that cool water. And I believe here this speaks to, you notice that even those inflows of water that were referenced in the image of the lake from above and below are gone. It's just still and cool. And sukha, pleasure, is still and quiet. So, the next step well, and just to say also that that can also fulfill at least some of the enlightenment factor of passaddhi, or tranquility, which is the fifth enlightenment factor. And then one breathes in and out, becoming sensitive to what are called chitta sankhara, or mental formations. And that can seem like an esoteric term, but it means the thoughts and perceptions which one has in the mind. And it's as if after one has become still in their mind in this way, then the play of the thoughts and articulations that are on the surface of the mind become much more apparent, because one is resting in something more stable below it all. So because one can see the canvas more, the writing, the shapes manifesting on the front of that canvas become very visible. And one can allow them to calm, which is the next step, naturally. One allows these perceptions that one has been applying to fade a bit. So that might mean that this fairly complicated visualization of the body and of energies coursing through it, one allows it to fade, and one comes just to rest in the sensation of the breath again. And this is important in that as one gains an awareness of this wider energy coursing through the body, through all these previous steps, one has also cultivated a simultaneous awareness with one point of the breath, usually at the tip of the nose, which isn't cultivated to the exclusion of the whole wide field of awareness, but rather with it. And an analogy that's frequently given is of a spider resting at the center of a web, yet sensitive to the whole web. So one may find that as the body calms, one's awareness naturally comes to rest on the tip of the nose, or at another place where the breath feels very prominent. And it can track it extremely continuously, even through those moments of what initially felt like space between the inhalation and the exhalation. One maintains a continuous awareness through there as the breath becomes more subtle, as if one is following a smooth silk thread. And sometimes the awareness will oscillate between the wide awareness and the pinpointed awareness at the nose until they merge, or sometimes one may be able to just have them merge and be aware of somehow both that point at the nose and also the wider body. And as the chitta sankhara, these mental formations and thoughts, begin to dissolve, it can be very disorienting, because this is usually how we orient ourselves in our mental landscape. And so one may find it's very helpful then to bring one's attention to rest on that very concrete, simple sensation of, say, the breath at the nose, but with the wider awareness of the body as well. And these formations fade. These thoughts become more subtle. And one finds that they can relax their intentional, say, one may be visualizations or articulations, say, of asking oneself, can I remain with the breath? May I remain with the breath? Which one may have been using up until then. That may get shortened simply to the word breath every now and again, dropped into the meditation, and then one can step back and just let it resonate. And frequently for me, I find that these mental formations manifest as knots in the head and body before the actual articulation comes into being. Usually a thought or thought pattern will manifest in the body first. So one can allow the mind to go to that, and for me, briefly clenching around it and releasing it like a trigger point, which is where in massage you press on a knot and it hurts for a second, but then it relaxes. So frequently there's a tightness in the head, and one can allow awareness to gravitate to it, clench around it, and then release, and it'll drop back to the chest. Which brings us to the third tetrad, which is mindfulness of the mind, which is the third foundation. And at this point, it's as if that bright, luminous, still awareness has become so prominent, and those shapes have begun to fade that played on the front of it, that the canvas, the awareness itself, has become visible in a way it usually isn't. So the first step of this tetrad is to become sensitive to the mind, the chitta, the mind-heart. And if one has cultivated these previous steps with skill, then this radiant, calm, still awareness is much more prominent. And then one breathes in, gladdening the mind, calming the mind, and finally liberating the mind. And I think this can speak to several things. One is simply the fact that it can be disorienting to enter into a place with such a still and calm awareness, but if one drops in a perception of brightness, say a thought of metta, one finds that it pervades the whole space extremely easily, because all the obstacles have been removed. It's one smooth, unbroken canvas. So a drop of golden dye will spread easily. And this can very much help. If one brightens it first, then the mind can calm and concentrate naturally. And Longpo Pasno references this frequently. He says we have it all backwards. We think that once we gain concentration, we'll be happy. But it's that once we are happy, then we can gain concentration. And similarly in this microcosm of the meditation, if one brightens that space first, then the mind will gather around it much more willingly, because it's such a bright place to be. And then to liberate the mind can either be taken on a level of transcendent liberation from a place of calm, because this practice, the Buddha says, can take one to full enlightenment. But it can also mean, as this entire tetrad can, that one applies this analysis of one's mind state to all of the meditation, even up until this point, because these tetrads can occur simultaneously. So in the earlier stages, one can take stock of one's mind. Is one restless? Is one calm? Is one drowsy? One becomes sensitive to the mind. And then if one's mind seems drowsy or dull, then one gladdens the mind. If one's mind seems restless or anxious or scattered, then one can calm the mind. And if one finds that one has remained long enough with a meditation object, say one of these steps, say the course, inhalation and exhalation, to the point where one feels ready to move on to the next step, this is liberating the mind from a coarse or lower state of meditation to a more refined one. This is a long talk, but I think we're almost there. So the fourth tetrad corresponds to analysis of Dhammas. And and those previous steps of the mind correspond with the enlightenment factors of calming, which is the sixth, and equanimity. And then this fourth tetrad, steps 13 through 16, are one breathes in and out, contemplating impermanence, breathes in and out, contemplating cessation or dispassion, breathes in and out, contemplating cessation, and breathes in and out, contemplating relinquishment. And either one can be applying this to, just as with the third tetrad, one can apply this to any point in the meditation. One sees how the perception one is applying, or the meditation object, how it is changing constantly. And this is the impermanence aspect. And the initial stages of meditation in this sutta are more rife with impermanence. It's much more apparent than the later ones. For example, the inhalation and the exhalation that compose the first two steps involve a great deal of movement and change. But then one progresses to steadily more stable and unchanging states. For example, the state of pleasure, of still sukha, in the second tetrad is very stable, or of the mind itself, much more stable than the breath. So as one sees the impermanence of a lower meditation object, then one grows dispassionate towards it. And then one looks at how it passes away. And then one relinquishes it and moves on to the next step. And so these four steps of the last tetrad can be applied at any point, and are. And that's how we move through the whole process. It's the process of seeing that the rung of the ladder that we've pulled ourselves up on is no longer as attractive as it was, and letting go and reaching for the next. Relinquishing the lower rung. However, it can also be applied on a much higher level, in that when we find ourselves in a calm place of mind through the cultivation of deep states of unification of mind, then we can finally see clearly. Only when the mind becomes still does it gain power. And this is the great secret of samadhi practice, is that it lends the mind immense strength to cut through everything. And it could be phrased simply as stop and look. Concentration and insight. Just stop and look. But one can also just think of the experience of being on a train and trying to pick out forms in the landscape as it rushes past. It's hard, but if one stops at the station, then one can see clearly. And the still mind is able to see clearly a great deal about one's life and the situation around one. And one can see with clarity one of the key insights in the whole Buddhist path, which is just that things change. All things that arise cease. We are surrounded by a vortex of shifting conditions that we constantly try to grab and make stable, and we cannot. But only the still mind, the happy mind, is the only mind that is willing to see that, because it's happy in and of itself. And in our normal state, because we don't have that robust sense of refuge, we are unwilling at a subconscious level to see the true fragility of our situation. And Bhante Analayo has a great analogy or image for these last 4 steps. When one contemplates impermanence, it's as if one's looking at a road and watching cars pass, come and go, come and go. And when one breathes in and out contemplating dispassion, it's as if one turns one's head towards, away from the cars entering, and just seeing them pass one at a time, which is contemplating cessation. So instead of seeing them come and go, one turns one head slightly so that one is just seeing them go. And finally, giving relinquishment is when one turns away altogether. And I think that this can initially come across as dour or cold, but it's not. The strange thing is that when we stop trying, when we have a source of happiness internally, and when we see the fragility of a happiness completely dependent on external conditions, whether relationships, our well-being in the body, any of these things, then what we come to is a place where we no longer are constantly trying to control the world around us and the people around us and make them be as we want them to be. And where subconsciously we are not constantly projecting our own hungers and needs onto the world. And this is the irony, that when one steps a little bit away from the world, or from what most people consider the world, one actually comes much closer to it. Because most of us exist in a hall of mirrors. And so many of our relationships are characterized at a deep level by what we project onto the other in terms of our own needs and wants, and a white-knuckled grip on what we hope they will be for us. And if we can step back just a little by cultivating an internal refuge, so we don't need them to act a certain way, and by seeing the delicacy, the impermanence of a happiness completely dependent on those external conditions, then we can exist, we can actually see the world again. Then we can sit down with the friend or family member or loved one and just let them be as they are and be very present with them and give them a love that is liberative, which is freeing, instead of a love which is based on attachment and control, which is not love. And I think we all have sensed this, how when we come into a place of calm, when we have a happiness and a wealth internally, then we have a gift to give others, and we want to give it to them. And a freshness comes back into life where it had been absent. And this is hard to explain, but the Buddha focused in all these cases on what one is giving up, because to articulate what lies beyond that risks reifying it and risks one becoming attached to it. So much more often he just spoke of what you're letting go of and trusted that you would come to those higher states of happiness and know them for oneself. And this applies on a day-to-day level of practice. I think we all sense that, how that subtle taste of these quiet states of a life that is more restrained and based in practice and purpose become far more attractive over time than one based on constant distraction and movement and running from our suffering. But it also applies to the highest of all goals, complete liberation. And I think we can take heart in the few moments where the Buddha did indicate something about that final state. In the suttas, in about 2 instances, he speaks of the unconditioned consciousness. Vinyanang anidasanang anantang sabatopabang. Consciousness without surface, without end, radiant all around. And he gives an analogy of awareness usually as light landing on a house. And then he asks, if you remove one wall of that house, where does the light land? And the other monks answer, it lands on the other wall, the west wall. And he says, if you remove that wall, where does it land? And they say, the ground. And he says, if you remove the ground, where does it land? And they say, it does not. And he says, just so, there's this awareness without surface. And I think I can't speak to this in any detail, but I think the analogy of light is especially beautiful as an analogy for nibbana, enlightenment, because light has a similar quality of being of a completely different nature than everything else in the world in a certain sense. So the speed of light is not relative. If one, say, runs at a train moving at 60 miles an hour, then, and one runs at it at 15 miles an hour, then the train would seem like it's approaching one at 75 miles an hour. But even if one runs away from a particle of light or towards a particle of light, it always has the same speed. And similarly, with Einstein's theory of relativity, all objects are rushing through space-time at the speed of light, which means that something traveling at the speed of light, namely light, doesn't experience time. And also, although they've tried as hard as they could initially to classify light as a wave or a particle, they can't. So it's this element completely outside of our way of conceptualization. And I think much of the Buddhist path can be looked at as replacing the energy of an agitated fire with the energy of light. So I can't speak in any detail of those, of that end goal, but I did find the Buddha's analogy of light to be especially beautiful. And this suta's a great resource. It parallels numerous other ones. It's extremely practical. I find it comes back into my practice year after year and after day. And it's the scaffolding which can allow one to move towards, I think, profound insight and a state which will be of great benefit for oneself and for the world. So this is the last of the 4 tetrads. That was a lot. Hope it's okay. It's a lot to get through. If people have a few quick comments or points of discussion, we can bring them up. The number of the Aritta Sutta Patti asks, Samyutta Nikaya 56 something. I can't remember exactly. It's spelled Aritta. So that's where you can look it up, I believe. It's a great sutta. Oh, hey, Ben. Good to see you. Okay, I think I have a little, let's see, old friend. Hey, Hannah and Ben. Mary Webster, good to see you. Good to see all of you guys. Okay, so one question. Is it true that an arahant could probably ever suppress consciousness of another arahant? Oh man, I don't know. I don't know even really what suppressing another consciousness would imply. Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know how to speak to that completely. Is it true that once one reaches an arahant, full enlightenment, there is no more romance for them? In terms of sexual lust, that has been given up. Yes. In terms of a poignancy and deep engagement with the world, I would say that you know, on a wholesome level, that only becomes more apparent. One looks at how, say, Longpo Cha, Ajahn Chah interacted with the world, and it was extremely. He had a good time, you know, and was a blessing to everything around him. Okay, if anyone, yeah, I'm kind of talked out. All right, so I think that'll be it for these specific instructions or discussions. But yeah, in coming Fridays, perhaps we'll approach other topics as well. Thanks for running through this marathon with me.